It's a little while since I've been a student, as you can probably tell by looking at me, but when I was a student I studied psychology and zoology at the University of Bristol. I know what you're thinking, obviously because I did psychology, but I know what you're thinking. Yes, it is a weird combination, psychology and zoology. Yes, I can talk to animals, but it's one of the reasons why I find this title really, really interesting. As a kind of, I guess I like to consider myself an amateur psychologist now, sort of non-practicing psychologist. I've got a degree in it. I don't kind of do it as a job now, but I'm still really sort of fascinated by people and by what makes us tick. But also, this is a really important and interesting question for someone like me who's a psychologist and also a Christian. What kind of God is just an illusion? Is God just a trick of the mind? Is he just a sort of psychological comfort blanket? Is he just something just a way that lots of people delude themselves? There are something like 2.2 billion Christians in the world, and actually about 88% of the world's population believe in some kind of God. So if God is just an illusion, then a lot of people in the world are deluding themselves. We're talking about billions of people believing something that isn't real. And I'm one of them, if God is just an illusion. And often when people talk about religion, when they talk about religious faith, often people sort of say, well, that's okay. You know, if it's comforting for you, if it's a nice thing for you to believe, then maybe it's okay that you believe in something that isn't true. But of course it matters, doesn't it? It matters if it's true or not. We're talking about some pretty important claims, about some pretty big questions about what the universe is like, who we are, how we fit into the universe. So to just kind of claim it doesn't matter if it's good for you, if it's comforting for you, then that's okay, you believe it, even though it's not true. I can't think of any other area of life where we'd be okay with that kind of thing, believing something which we know to be false, no matter how comforting it is. I guess as a psychologist, I'm really interested in how this whole idea has kind of come about and been talked about. And I guess Sigmund Freud is probably the person, like the psychologist, who popularised this idea. If you studied psychology, you'll know that Sigmund Freud kind of gets a bit of a chuckle when he's mentioned in kind of psychological discussion. But his ideas have had a really big impact on the study of psychology and kind of psychological theories about human nature and the things that we believe. And he suggested that maybe God is some kind of, well, he called him an exalted father figure. This is how he describes it in his book, The Future of Illusion. He says, they are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest and most urgent wishes of mankind. As we already know, the terrifying impression of helplessness in childhood aroused the need for protection through love, which was provided by the Father. Thus, the benevolent rule of divine providence allays our fear of the dangers of life. The benevolent rule of divine providence allays our fear of the dangers of life. Do you see what Freud was saying as he said that? It's a scary old world out there. So we imagine a father figure in the sky looking down on us, taking care of us. Freud ultimately saw the idea of God, as he saw most of the problems that people have, as something childish and immature which you need to grow out of. Of course, we have to ask, well, what is to stop us turning that idea around, actually? What if the childish, immature desire is the desire to escape responsibility, to escape a God who's looking down on us? And so maybe it's we could turn it around and we could suggest that maybe it's the atheist who looks at the world and looks up into the sky, and in an attempt to escape the idea of God looking down, looks to the sky and sees nothing there. It's the same reasoning that we could use. And actually, the amount that we want something to be true, the amount of comfort that we get from an idea, doesn't actually tell us anything helpful about the truthfulness of an idea, does it? So we're brought up to be suspicious of things that seem too good to be true. At least that's how I was brought up, and I imagine it's true in Scotland as well. So when a Nigerian millionaire emails you and says, there's $27 million waiting for you if you just email me your bank details, we immediately know that that is too good to be true, don't we? And so we're suspicious and we think it probably therefore isn't true. And we err on the side of caution. And probably in that case you'd be right, but it's a pretty flawed way of evaluating things, isn't it? If something is good, then it's probably not true. And the better it is, the less likely it is to be true. That's actually, logically, a pretty flawed way of evaluating ideas. Because the goodness of a statement only tells us whether we should want it to be true or not. It doesn't actually tell us anything about whether an idea is true. Someone else who's talked about this is a guy who lectured me at university, actually, a guy called Professor Bruce Hood. And he, you might have seen him on the Royal Institution Christmas lectures, if that's how you spend your Christmas holidays. You might have seen him on those a few years ago. He's an expert in cognitive development, and he's written a book called Supersense, which is all about superstition and why humans believe in things which aren't true. And he suggests that the human brain naturally looks for patterns and order in the world around us, right from birth. It's a mechanism, it's a process which helps us to learn about the world, but at the same time, the love that we have for order and patterns in the world can lead us to superstition. And we can end up seeing meaning and relationship in the world where actually there isn't any. Because we find the predictability of the world comforting. If we think that if we wear a certain item of clothing, or if we throw salt over our shoulder, or whatever it is, then we'll influence the world around us and we'll be able to make good things happen. We find that idea comforting. And Bruce Hood sees the idea of God as being kind of the ultimate overarching pattern and explanation for the world. We believe that there's a God there ordering the world around us, and we find that idea comforting. He says, I would argue that our brains have a mind design that leads us naturally to infer structures and patterns in the world and to make sense of it by generating intuitive theories. As children discover more about the world, they should progress to a more scientific view of the world. Clearly, this does not necessarily happen. Quite a lot of similarities with what Freud would say, aren't there? It's a comforting way of looking at the universe, but it's a childish, immature thing, and actually we should all be aiming to grow out of this idea that there's a God giving order and meaning to the world. He's partly right, isn't he, that we do love to see order in our world. We do love to be able to, it gives us comfort to understand why things happen. And sometimes that can lead us to explanations which aren't true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all of our explanations for why things happen are untrue. Basically, we're right to be a bit suspicious of our brains and what our brains are telling us, aren't we? But I don't think Freud or Hood would tell us to be totally suspicious of our brains, that we can never understand what's really going on in the world. Because if you do that, if you do claim that your brain is completely unreliable, then people like Freud or Bruce Hood are claiming some sort of exception, as though they've risen above the sort of immaturity that all of us are guilty of, and that they've somehow managed to see what's really going on, which is a slightly arrogant way slightly arrogant claim to make, isn't it? And then finally, a third sort of voice in this conversation that you might have heard of is a guy called Derren Brown. I don't know if there's any Derren Brown fans in the room. I'm a big fan of Derren Brown. I think what he does is brilliant. Also, he was a student at Bristol University, a little bit before I was there, but we have that in common. And he made, a couple of years ago, he made 2 shows called Fear and Faith. And in the second one, called Faith, he convinced an atheist woman, a woman who claimed herself to be an atheist at the start of the programme, he convinced her that she believed in God. He gave her an experience. After talking to her for a few minutes, he gave her an experience, an intensely emotional experience of love and connection with a higher power that she called a belief in God. This is the woman, and so this is him kind of encountering her in the street and trying to convince her to take part in the experiment. And then this is the moment where she realises, where she has this experience. She's sitting in a kind of old church building surrounded by candles. Derren Brown talks to her for 15 minutes. There's a timer going in the corner of the room, corner of the screen. And then he leaves her alone, and in a couple of minutes, suddenly she has this really intense experience. And afterwards, he explains how he did it, how he gave her this experience. He says that he talked to her and gave her really subtle cues to recall experiences she had of being loved and cared about, positive experiences of a father figure. And then, when he leaves her alone, those cues connected with the setting that she's in, this sort of religious setting that she's in, suddenly she has this really intense experience. And the point that he's making, again, is quite clear, isn't it? Darren is able to create an experience of a belief in God. Not just an intellectual belief, but an actual feeling that she's experiencing God's presence with her. And so the claim is, well, God must be an illusion then, because Darren has managed to create the illusion for this woman. And if Darren Brown can fake belief in God, then maybe God himself is fake. But again, we have to be careful here, don't we? I used to live in Southend-on-Sea in Essex, and a few years ago there was a guy there who was arrested for impersonating a doctor. He applied for a job at a surgery, he had some fake papers and no one really bothered to check how reliable they were. He got a job as a doctor. He was only discovered when it turned out that he wasn't actually very good at being a doctor. He didn't have any training, and so he eventually got found out. But does that mean that all doctors are frauds? Does that mean that I should be suspicious of every doctor that I meet? Well, of course not. Just because something can be faked doesn't mean that every instance of it, therefore, is faked. Just because one doctor can fraudulently practice as a doctor doesn't mean that every doctor that you meet is a fraud. And just because Darren Brown can create an experience of God, can fake an experience of belief in God, that doesn't mean, therefore, that God himself is fake and that every other experience that a religious person might have is faked. So the question was, is God an illusion? Or it was, what kind of God is an illusion? So is God an illusion? If you followed me so far, I think you'll see that we're at the point of saying, maybe, maybe not. Which isn't really much of an answer, is it? That's not why you've come here today, for me to say, oh, maybe, maybe not. God could be an illusion, but that doesn't mean that he definitely is where we're up to so far. The God I believe in could be a comfort blanket, or he could be a trick of my mind. I could be deluding myself. But it's wrong to conclude that therefore God is an illusion and that I am just deluding myself. But like I say, that isn't much of a conclusion, is it? It's not much of a reason for the CU to get you all to come in here and give you a free lunch and then sit you down to listen to this. Faced with this possibility, is God an illusion? The possibility that he might be, but equally the possibility that he might not be, we need to decide. As I said at the beginning, this is a huge question, isn't it? And it's not really one where we can just say, well, maybe, maybe not, it doesn't really matter. It really, really does matter. The question is far too important for us to sit on the fence. The famous biologist Richard Dawkins makes the point that a universe where there is a God is very different to a universe where there is no God. And I want to say as equally strongly as Richard Dawkins would say it, that we need to decide which it is. We need to know what kind of universe we live in, because it has huge implications for what the world is like, how we fit into it, and what it means for us to be human. And that if there really is a God, if we can know him, if we can know what he's like, then that's something which we really have to know about. Maybe just isn't good enough. We need to be careful. All of these warnings from Freud, from Bruce Hood, from Darren Brown, I think that we need to be careful. We need to be careful on the things that we accept, the things that we put our trust in. With all of these warnings ringing in our ears, though, we need to decide. What we need is evidence. We need good evidence. We need to check it out for ourselves and decide where, rather than just going on our feelings and what we would like to be true, are there good reasons for believing that this is true? Are there good reasons for believing that there is a God? And that's really what this week of events that the sea are putting on is all about. Working out if there really are good reasons to believe this. I believe there are, and the CU believe that there are too. That's why they're putting these events on. As a Christian, I don't just talk about God as a philosophical concept or a kind of abstract set of ideas or a variable in an experiment. I believe that God is personal. And he stepped into the world, stepped into our world, in the person of Jesus Christ. And whatever your first reaction to that claim, as I claim that God has stepped into the world in the person of Jesus, whatever your reaction, you can't deny, again, that the implications are huge. Someone else who believed this was a guy called John, one of Jesus' friends. He lived with Jesus, he travelled with Jesus, and then eventually he wrote a book all about Jesus, which you can find in the Bible. It's kind of a biography of Jesus' life. And listen to just one sentence from the beginning of that book. Actually, I realised I put the wrong reference down there. It should have a 4 at the end. So this is from the first chapter of John's book about Jesus. And he makes this claim: the Word is a title that John uses for his friend Jesus. The Word, Jesus, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. But John also claims that Jesus himself is God, and that God himself, Jesus, the Word, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He stepped into our world as one of us. And that has some really huge implications as we think about whether there's a God or not. If Jesus came into the world to reveal God to us as God himself, then it answers that fundamental question, doesn't it? Is there a God? Is God real? Well, if Jesus is him, then he is. It's a fairly simple logical point, isn't it? If Jesus is God, then there has to be a God for Jesus to be. So I wonder what you make of that. I wonder what you make of that claim that Jesus is God stepping into our world. As I said, you can't ignore that claim, I don't think. You can disagree with it, or you can agree with it, but you can't ignore it. If Jesus is who John claims him to be, and if he's who I claim him to be, then it has a massive impact on what we think about the world and who we are. It means that we can look at Jesus, we can look at how he treats people, we can listen to the things he said, we can look at the things that he did, and we can see what God is like. So instead of rather than just answering the question, is there a God, is he more than an illusion, we can go beyond that and say, well actually, if God is real, what is he like? What is this God like? Now we're separated obviously by geography, and we're separated by time. But I believe in things like World War II and Henry VIII and Julius Caesar. There are ways of us investigating things that are separated from us by time and geography. We can look at the evidence, we can look at the documents, we can look at what people wrote down about those events. And all this week we're inviting people to have a look at some of the source documents themselves. There should be one of these near to you. Do grab it, pick it up. And if you've never seen one of these before, basically it's another account of Jesus' life, written by a historian and a doctor called Luke. Again, this is taken from the Bible. If you open that up, it's another account put together by eyewitness accounts by this guy Luke. You can read that, you can look at it. And you can look at the first kind of sentences of Luke's Gospel, and Luke explains that he put this together so that people could read it and be convinced of who Jesus is. There's no hidden agenda. The first couple of sentences he says that. And so I want to challenge you, encourage you, invite you, whatever it takes, to have a look at who Jesus is for yourself this week. We've got loads of other talks going on, loads of other questions being answered, lots of opportunities for you to really dig into finding out more about who Jesus is. But the question was, is God an illusion? I said earlier, we sometimes think that if something is too good to be true, then it probably isn't true. Actually, the God we're talking about here, if it's not true, then it's not good. It's a lie, it's kind of false hope. Actually, I think that this is good because it's true. And so what you need to do is investigate, is this true? And when you've discovered, I hope, that it is true, then you'll find out how good it is. Okay, I think we're going to have, that's all I've got to say. I think we're going to have some questions now. I think Claire's going to come up and give me a chance. Oh yeah, so the number is at the top of the screen here. So you can keep texting questions, but we're going to do questions from the floor as well, so if you'd rather use your powers of speech to ask questions, then you can do that too. I'll hand the microphone to Claire.
Okay, first question. If psychology can't really show us whether there is a God, isn't agnosticism the best option?
Good question. No, I don't think so. What I was trying to say in talking about the psychology, lots of people would say Derren Brown's managed to fake belief. I can think of a psychological explanation for why people might think there's a God. Therefore, I think it's not true. What I'm trying to show in this talk is that those explanations don't tell us that God isn't true. I don't think they then go on to tell us that he definitely is real. But what you shouldn't do is listen to the psychological theories or watch Derren Brown's TV programs and then think, well, that's case closed. Actually, there are ways, I think, of knowing that there is a God and knowing what he's like. And that is by looking at the person of Jesus, which is what John invites us to do. It's what Luke invites us to do as we read the sources. So, no, I don't think I think basically agnosticism is keeping your options open. But as I said in the talk, I think the question is too important for us to sit on the fence. Actually, you've got to get off the fence. You might decide to go one way or the other. I obviously hope that you'll discover that this is true. But I think the thing not to do is to just be content with having the question. I think this is a question we need to get to the bottom of.
Does anyone have anything to say about that? Any other questions on that particular? No? No? More questions? Okay. Choose. If Derren Brown can talk people into believing in God, then how do you know that you aren't just trying to do that too?
If only I had the skills of Derren Brown. But I hope I wouldn't use them to try and just trick you all into believing that there's a God. In fact, no, I definitely wouldn't use my skills. I'm always a little bit worried when I mention Derren Brown in a talk that he might be in the room and then be able to do something, but he's not here, is he? So I guess, having said all of that, there may be an outside chance that I do have those kind of powers and that I am trying to mess with your heads and just make you believe in God with no evidence. But what I'm trying to say here is that we do need to be careful. We need to recognise that we're all naturally have this capacity to believe things which aren't true. We want to. But that doesn't mean that we never believe things which are true, that we're incapable of working out what's true and what isn't. And so, okay, you might think that me standing up here, I'm trying to convince you, but that's why I think it's a good idea for you to take these sources, these documents away, and look at them for yourself, when I'm not in the room trying to convince you. I know that members of the CU would love to sit down with you and help you to look at this stuff, but again, they won't be wanting to try and convince you, they'll just help you ask good questions about it. Yeah, absolutely. Be suspicious of me if you want to, but don't let that stop you from looking at kind of independent sources and documents so you can make your own conclusions.